severe than the droughts in 74, 75 and 84, 85, those historic famines that occurred. In this particular case, there were food shortages, there was a slight decline in GDP, but generally speaking, the economy carried on being very resilient. So I think that's one indicator of the new resilience of the Ethiopian economy, that it's able to cope with those kind of shocks in a way that it wasn't able to previously. If I move forward. In terms of production, we do actually see, in terms of gross value added, a decline in agriculture's share, GDP, from 57% down to 43%, and a diversification into other sectors, particularly commerce, has grown quite notably since the early 90s. However, if you look at manufacturing, despite the very significant growth of manufacturing, in terms of percentage of GDP, it's still relatively low. It's still in the region of around 5% of GDP. Now that partly reflects the pace of growth of the overall economy at 10%. That means the GDP for manufacturing has been keeping pace with that overall growth, but not outpacing it. And hence, manufacturing is still a relatively small share of overall GDP of the economy. We'll come back to that point, I think, very briefly. Production linkages, that's one of the emphases of the STEPS profiles, to look at the degree of integration into regional and global value chains. There have been some improvements in the case of Ethiopia, as you can appreciate, but relatively modest. I'll say a little bit more on that in some brief conclusions. One of the striking things I think about Ethiopia's development is the extent to which the country has been successful in attracting foreign direct investment. FDI has been fundamental to this process of structural transformation of the economy. In 2016, the last year for which we have the complete figures, Ethiopia was the leading recipient of FDI in the whole of Eastern Africa, over $3 billion US. And that now outpaces countries such as Tanzania and DRC. And at odds with those countries, the sectorial breakdown of that FDI is quite different, as you can see from this graph. Over 50% of the FDI into Ethiopia colleagues in their respective country profiles have done a similar job. We've disaggregated it into between sector and within sector productivity growth. Now, the between sector productivity growth is structural transformation. We are measuring there the extent to which workers have moved from low productivity activities, normally associated with agriculture, into higher valued added activities in services and manufacturing. And you can appreciate in the period there, the first period where we had the data available to do it, for 1999 to 2005, within sector productivity growth was 2.3%. Between sector, structural transformation was very low share of total growth. Where we get to 2005 and 2013, we see suddenly there's a much larger between sector share, 1.6% of the total productivity growth over that period is attributable by shifting from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. Having said that, I think everybody would agree there's scope for further between sector productivity growth. The figures are encouraging, going in the right direction, but if you look at the Asian examples of fast industrializers, you will see actually it will be 2/3 between sector growth and only 1/3 within sector growth. So there is still a lot of growth possibilities for the Ethiopian economy, and I think my colleagues will probably say that for the other STEP country profile cases as well. I think I'll move straight to society for reasons of time. Demographic trends. Fertility rates have been declining quite sharply in Ethiopia, especially in urban areas such as Addis now. You have fertility rates comparable now with high-income countries, which is also an important part of the debate about structural transformation because of the demographic dividend and the feasibility of reaping that demographic dividend. Fertility rates are still high in our sub-region. We have some of the highest, indeed, in the whole of Africa. DRC, for example, Uganda, still fertility rates in excess of six children per woman. But the trend here in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, you see is clearly on a downward trend. One issue that comes up repeatedly in discussions about growth in Ethiopia is the extent to which it has been equally distributed, the fruits from economic growth. There has been concerns raised about rising income inequality. We do not see this reflected so far in the official statistics on the Gini coefficient, but we do when we see it broken down somewhat in income shares. The data is rather out of date now, 2010, but you can see that the upper quintile of the population, the richest quintile of the population, has over the last 10 years or so been gaining a larger share of total growth, while the lowest quintile has seen its share of growth reduced somewhat. So that's another issue perhaps for some discussion. And very finally then, just to quickly summarize some key messages from our report, and I would stress, I'm just cherry picking a couple of key messages here. Deeper region and integration should be a priority. If you look at the trade figures for Ethiopia, the intra-regional trade component is extremely low. If you look at the African Regional Integration Index, it's the lowest in COMESA. It ranks lowest. Now I know in Ethiopia there have been efforts made in some domains, so for example energy, with the finalization of the dam. Now there are projects to trade energy across the sub-region, which are to be welcomed. But in the trade and investment side, Ethiopia is relatively close to its neighbours, and we think that there's a lot of growth potential and opportunities, particularly now we're discussing the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area for Ethiopia to benefit from a greater openness to the sub-region. So that would be one of the key messages. As is the case with many economies in our sub-region, growth has been led, as I mentioned, partly by FDI, but principally by the public sector. And I think there's a realization in many countries in our region that we need to have a stronger private sector. A large share of total fixed investment in this country is accounted for by government. And ideally, you would like to see the private sector start to take more protagonism. And at the moment, the private sector investment you've seen is principally by the foreign direct investments, but relatively little by the domestic investors into the productive sectors. So that's an area for perhaps some discussion, to how to create a more conducive business environment. We saw that there has been an acceleration of structural transformation over the period under study, but we believe that Ethiopia could benefit further from accelerating that process of structural transformation into manufacturing and modern services. And finally, and I think this takes us back to the regional integration agenda, despite some economic diversification, technological upgrading and stronger production linkages will be key in the future to add in more value added.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm not as fluent in Amharic as Andy. It is my opportunity now to invite Aziz to make the presentation of the Morocco country profile. I believe he's going to make it in French, so I would invite those that need it to utilize the services of interpretation. Thank you. Aziz, the floor is yours.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, merci Monsieur le Président. Je vais donc faire ma présentation en français. Présentation qui porte sur le profil pays du Maroc. Je vais commencer ma présentation avec exactement le même graphique qui a été présenté pour le cas éthiopien. Un graphique qui met en relation la croissance économique et le phénomène du déficit pluviométrique au Maroc. Comme vous le voyez dans le graphique, donc on a une courbe qui représente un peu l'évolution de la croissance économique depuis 1990 jusqu'à 2016 en courbe, et donc on barre les phénomènes de déficit pluviométrique sur la période. Vous voyez bien sur la période, sur l'année, par exemple la campagne 91-92, un gros déficit pluviométrique qui entraîne une grande chute du taux de croissance économique du Maroc. De même 94-95, et pour citer juste un exemple de la le dernier déficit pluviométrique important qu'a connu le pays, c'est sur la période 2015, sur la campagne 2015-2016. Ce qui est intéressant, et c'est là l'enseignement, et c'est absolument pour ça que je voulais absolument présenter ce graphique en premier.
To show this slide to you is that it summarizes in a telling way the structural transformation process which is currently underway in Morocco. It presents it elegantly.
To the mic because we can't hear you. But in any case, if you can use this and then you change the channels, if you can still hear him in French if you so desire, in case he cannot raise his voice more than he is currently. So, go ahead, sorry.
Is this better now? Even more, very well. Not the most comfortable positions, but let's do it. So I said that this diagram represents, in a fairly telling way, economic growth versus drought. And we can see the trend in the transformation of the country, the economy of the country. What is interesting is that before the years 2000, economic growth often varied rather strongly. And it was the same in Ethiopia, I believe. And starting in 2000, we do see that the rate of growth is more stable. And during the last significant drought, I'm referring here to 2015-2016, this was one of the strongest droughts for the last 30 years, and it didn't lead to a strong falling growth. So I'm just going to show you a few elements here on employment, production, and society. So in the field of production, generally speaking, we have seen that Morocco is experiencing a structural transformation. The structural transformation of the Moroccan economy is in fact one of moving from an agricultural economy to one of services. This is something we note in terms of value added, but also when one looks at trends in employment. Now, what is quite striking in the Moroccan case is that within the secondary sector, I'm referring to the industrial sector, we have two trends in fact. On the one hand, traditional industry is declining, and it's not sufficiently compensated by new forms of industry. So traditional industry in Morocco, now the most specific example is garment, textiles and clothes. We see that over the last 20 to 30 years, the value added of the structure is declining, and it's not sufficiently compensated by positive trends in new forms of industry. Metalworks, car manufacturing and electronics, amongst others. Now, the analysis of the technological content of exports confirms the emergence of these new products and their potential in terms of more significant industrial development in the future. Now we have the more specific case of car manufacturing, which 2-3 years ago became more significant, the sector became more successful, more significant than phosphates, the exports in terms of exports. This is a significant achievement of the industrial policy of our country, and this backs up the potential of these new industries which we notice. So the trade balance of Morocco is structurally in deficit. It suffers from a weakness of diversification and in terms of competitiveness on the global level. And so these new, as I said, these new forms of industry are not compensating for the decline in all forms. So in terms of employment, of course, yes, these are general trends, but over and beyond the returns of physical capital, we will require an improvement in the value added of our human capital, and we have noted that more significant investment in the labor force is important to improve the productivity of the workforce, especially in the agricultural sector, where we have noted a decline since 2012, despite positive trends in 2015 of 0.4%. But the general lesson learned from this is that there is a decline in terms of value added in the industrial sector. And this is happening at the very same time as we are noting, and we see this in terms of the value added of the sector, we note an increase of the capitalist intensity in the industrial sector, one which is of course pushed by these new forms of activities such as car manufacturing, plane manufacturing, and others. As far as society is concerned, our social development, Morocco is enjoying a demographic window. So there is availability of a young and highly qualified workforce. This demographic window, should enable us to decrease public expenditures in terms of education and health, and to better use the productive capacities of the country. I'm referring, of course, to this very young and better qualified workforce. Now, to be successful in terms of this move during this demographic window, it is, of course, necessary to meet the challenges of secondary education and training and the creation of a decent employment. To face up to the challenge of youth unemployment, it's fairly high in our country, and this echoes the situation number of North African states, other North African states. One indicator which I wish to underscore is the gaps and shortcomings in terms of rural young girls when it comes to availability of educational institutions to provide them with such high qualified education. So there are positive trends, however, and but if there are recommendations in this field, it's perhaps that one needs to focus funds and all efforts at difficult sectors, and I'm referring here to the one I just described, young rural girls. So we have initiated a structural transformation of our economy by involving the necessary productive forms of momentum and drivers which are necessary in the new global economy. There's a slow integration, but a consistent education of the national economy into global value chains, and of course the country does, however, have to improve the abilities of our human capital. In terms of key messages, so I'm going to, well, of course, I've already underscored our dependence, or the fact that the dependence of economic growth on rainfall has been reduced. Morocco should also further promote deep-rooted integration of the industrial fabric of the country to facilitate the participation of national enterprises. This is something that we see in the car manufacturing sector, which is perceived by national authorities as a success story, and perhaps less so in terms of employment, because of course our colleagues from the High Commissioner's Office can perhaps provide us more information on this, but there is a positive trend when it comes to this car making sector. This sector is mostly driven by foreign direct investment. This is positive in itself, but we are noting that there is a weak national integration. Only 30% of national enterprises are participating, so there might be something to look at in greater depth rather, at this level. So we need to work on the structural trade deficit of the country. The country should make the assessment of the relevance of sectorial policies in terms of their job creation potential more systematic, and the Ministry for Employment, through its strategy, has started integrating this consideration. I'm referring to assessing sectoral policies in terms of their benefits in terms of creating jobs, and of course one has to provide further training to the young workforce, especially focusing on rural young girls. Investing in young children is, of course, an investment for a better future. All of us understand this, the participation of women, and this is something that I do have to touch on. The participation of women in the economic life of the country is a challenge for Morocco. The rate of participation of women in the labor force is rather small, and Morocco will have to look at the place of women in the education and media systems. And of course, this is a social question, and it will require time, and things will have to change quite significantly. And by way of conclusion, the improvement of the productivity of the labor force requires greater investment in health. I'm referring here to non-communicable diseases. And of course, one also has to focus on education, and what is needed here is a national strategy for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aziz, for this presentation. Could I now invite Mama Keita to make the presentation of the Cameroonian STEPS profile? Mama, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le
Thank you so much, moderator. Good morning, participants. I'm going to present the STEPS profile for Cameroon. So, I'm going to start by presenting to you a summary of the main results, which our assessment of the evaluation of the process of structural transformation has yielded. This process took place in Cameroon over the last, or has taken place for the last 20 to 30 years. Now, we cannot carry out this assessment without starting by underscoring the huge natural potential which Cameroon enjoys. Cameroon has a number of trump cards when it comes to promoting a structural transformation. Cameroon has also carried out a number of efforts to promote its socio-economic transition. What are we referring to here? We have abundant natural resources, agricultural resources, forestry resources, hydroelectric resources, oil resources, magnificent tourist sites. All of this is something that Cameroon enjoys. So Cameroon possesses the third largest hydroelectric potential in Africa after Ethiopia and the DRC. We're also amongst the 6 main global producers of cocoa. So we do have resources, and these of course are trump cards, strong points. We have a significant framework for development which we have set up, which would enable us to achieve these objectives. And we have a long-term strategy, and we even have an industrialization plan, a framework plan. We're the main economy of the Central European Economic Community. Despite this, the transformation process for Cameroon is one which is not yet satisfactory. The results are ambiguous. Yes, we have noted a certain amount of diversification in Cameroon, but it's horizontal more than anything else, i.e. the exports of Cameroon mostly cover a number of products, but they're weak in terms of value added. So the products which are exported by Cameroon are not very sophisticated ones, and this means that what we're exporting are primary commodities. And this, of course, means that we're very vulnerable when it comes to the fluctuations in the prices of raw materials and commodities on global markets, and we regularly experience external shocks. The most recent one was that of 2014, which took place when the price of oil fell. This was, of course, was paralleled by the fall in the price of a number of other raw materials, and this led to a budgetary adjustment which was necessary. But despite this, we have also noted over the last 30 years a decline of the manufacturing sector. Very slow improvements in productivity in the industrial sector. The informal sector predominates. We were not able to create decent employment in sufficient quantity, and the economy was not successful in generating economic growth rates which are high and sustained. So as I said, economic growth rates unfortunately remain very dependent on global prices for raw materials. So our objective of 6% annual growth rates were not achieved. So at the social level, with this structural structure, this informal jobs market, we were not able to significantly and substantially reduce the poverty rate in the country. We have also noticed an increase in inequality, and these are all risk factors threatening the progress that has been achieved by the country. So a little more detail here. These tables just show you that the manufacturing subsector in Cameroon is declining. On the right side, you will see that the main source of growth in Cameroon in terms of jobs, employment, is the consumption of households. So investment hasn't yet taken up its rightful role as an engine, a driver of growth, something we saw in Asian states. And this, of course, is a result of the business environment as a whole. So, Cameroon's exports. As I said, we export a number of products, and this is a result of the resources which we possess in our country, natural resources. So we are exporting a number of products. There is some horizontal diversification. And when one looks at the exports themselves, you will see that it's mostly raw materials, and it hasn't really changed in the recent past. 66% of products are exported in raw format. So there is no value added at all. This is something to look at closely. Now, this slide shows you the complexity of the Cameroonian production system and its ability to place on the global markets sophisticated, complex products. Now, we focus on raw materials and so forth, and of course this doesn't require any state-of-the-art technologies, and so our production systems are not in line with what is expected on global markets and international markets. So there is work to be done here to improve the complexity of our productive system in Cameroon. Turning now to employment. This slide shows us that more than 80% of workers are found in the agricultural sector. If one looks in terms of trends, there has been a slight trend, yes. Jobs have moved slightly from the agricultural sector to the manufacturing sector. And the next slide will show us that this didn't lead to any substantial growth in productivity in Cameroon. In line with what happened in Ethiopia, something we saw earlier, intersectoral movements of laborers contribute favorably to improving the productivity of the economy, but in the case of Cameroon, the movement of employees contributes less and less. I don't know if you can see the small orange rectangles are beneath the zero line, which means that the fact that jobs are moving to a different sector, in fact, take away from productivity gains. And this, of course, is very negative in terms of the restructuring process. Now, in terms of society, this production structure, the social structure, what does it impact on the well-being of the Cameroonian population? Now, let us look at the demographic trends in the country. We can see that there is a decline in fertility. The number of children per woman has decreased, constantly so. The blue line is that of Cameroon. You'll find it between that of Chad and Gabon. So we're comparing it to two of our neighbors. So there is progress here. And the fall in fertility in Cameroon has enabled us to reduce the dependency rate, i.e., active workers, the active population, supports less of an inactive population. So they can generate additional revenue, which they can devote to improving the well-being of their families, their households, and if it is invested correctly in human capital, this, of course, can yield demographic dividends. So all of this needs, of course, to be promoted by the government correctly to ensure that all of this investment stands rather to benefit the well-being of the population in terms of the improvement of the conditions of life. So this economic structure, what was it successful in doing in terms of improving the living conditions of the Cameroonian population? Over the last 30 years, we have noticed that poverty has decreased, but not significantly so. Poverty at a national level unfortunately concerns more than a third of Cameroonian citizens. And if one disaggregates the data, one will see that in rural areas, over 50% of the population can be considered to be poor. In terms of inequality, what we see from the figures is that over the 90s, inequality decreased, but since then it has increased quite sharply. So in terms of income, but also between genders, opportunity in terms of access to schools, access to decent employment. There's regional inequality. The north of Cameroon, of course, benefits less from these improvements than the rest of the country. And all of this needs to look at very carefully, because we know with the Arab Spring that inequality and shortcomings in terms of living conditions can lead to social tensions, which of course can lead countries to regress in terms of their socio-economic development. So, what can we say? Cameroon, a very rich country, blessed by nature, but with a structural transformation process which has not yet enabled us to improve the living conditions of our population, to create decent employment, or to generate levels of growth, sustained growth. And we remain very vulnerable in the face of external shocks. What can we propose in Cameroon to improve the results of this structural transformation process? Well, it is essential to start with the business environment. We saw that Cameroonian investors are all in the informal sector. It represents 90% of the economy. So one needs to improve the business environment to draw national players into the formal economy. And then one has to look at formal foreign investment. But this should not just be done in a haphazard way. No, we need to also associate this with local content policies, associate this with decent jobs, and ensure that foreign direct investment, FDI, promotes technological development. It's an appropriate channel to do this. And all of this has to be done by the setting up of special economic zones, effective ones, because there are laws in Cameroon which provides for special economic zones, but they're not effective, and they don't promote this exchange of knowledge and this technological exchange between national and foreign enterprises. So, we have to boost competitiveness. It's necessary to ensure that we are able to insert our economy into global value chains, but we also have to not just integrate these value chains, we also have to move up in these global value chains and provide, or rather supply, the greatest value added possible. There's also a need for improved productivity to improve the gamut of our exports. And now we have to look at strong points in terms of competitiveness at an international level. As I said, social inequality are sources of tension. They represent risk factors for our economic transformation policy. We've seen, of course, that there is a demographic dividend, a lowering in the fertility rate and so forth, and so the resources which are generated by this must be invested in an appropriate way to ensure that this is effectively turned into a demographic dividend. We have to ensure that urbanization, which represents a great deal of potential, plays an effective role in industrializing the country. With our forestry potential, we'll also have to be very careful and see to it that the environment is protected. And finally, there are a number of reforms which are necessary, and the first factor which blocks the environment, the business environment in Cameroon, is corruption. Poor governance. There are reforms to be done here. And we say in this report that the state should be the primary player in terms of change. We have to provide a concept for the reforms, and they have to be implemented in an effective way. And finally, it would be remiss of me to conclude my discussion of this study without saying that Cameroon is facing a significant threat, a security threat, as a result of the presence of the Boko Haram group around our country. And Cameroon alone cannot overcome this challenge, and we call upon the international community as a whole to lend its support to Cameroon to face up to this challenge and to overcome these risks to enable us to continue our transformation process, which is currently underway. Thank you.
Last but not least, let me invite my colleague Ian Filakati to present the country profile of Zambia. Is Ian.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Director. I'm presenting the profile for Zambia. The slide up there just shows a few things about Zambia, the population and the GDP for 2017, which stands at 25.9 billion US dollars. By way of introduction, is that the development path of Zambia is guided by the National Long-Term Vision 2030 and the National Development Plans number 5, 6, and 7. And the main objective of the National Development Frameworks is to achieve a prosperous middle-income country by 2030. And the efforts towards structural development, structural transformation in the development frameworks, there's been a focus on sustainable development, inclusive economic growth and diversification, rural development, enhanced infrastructure and human development, job creation, poverty and vulnerability reduction, reduced development inequalities, and enhanced governance environment. And in terms of the three pillars of structural transformation, production, employment, and society, these were some of our findings. Yeah, the first thing under production is that large-scale structural transformation has not really taken place in Zambia, despite the changes that have occurred in production since the 1990s. As you can see from that figure there, minerals, predominantly copper, and metal products continue to dominate merchandise exports and production. The figure there shows that between 1990 and 2016, on the average, copper made up over 60% of merchandise exports. And for the three periods from 1990 to 2016, in each of the 10-year periods, the share would hover between 57% and 68%, averaging around 60%. And the value of these merchandise exports in terms of foreign value added has largely remained unchanged and constitutes a smaller proportion of traded value added compared to domestic value added. The next thing is that there are exports of semi-processed raw materials, such as copper cathodes, concentrates, which really imply a very limited domestic value addition and forward and linkages in the extractive sector into the domestic economy. And as I've already said, there is an over-dependence on copper and other related products. And this state of affairs in 2015 led to a decline of the GDP, the real GDP growth rate to 3.5 due to reduced copper earnings, which fell in 2014 which fell to 7.36 billion in 2015, 7.36 billion from they fell from 7.36 in 2014 to, excuse me, yeah, the earnings fell from 7.6 billion in 2014 to 7.36 in 2015. And their exports of, large exports of copper products as inputs into foreign manufacturing, which has exposed the country's inadequate integration into global value chains, and this tends to undermine optimal revenue collections. Overall, the technological content of manufactured products and exports remains low compared to other countries in the region. So there are current efforts to diversify away from copper and the export of other semi-finished products. These include the promotion of value addition, beneficiation, and linkages in agriculture, mining, and the forestry sectors, as well as the development of multi-facility economic zones. These present opportunities to increase exports of finished products and to develop domestic forward and backward, as well as knowledge and side stream linkages, which should ultimately enable the country to participate in regional and international value chains at higher levels. Also, local content regulations would enhance participation of local entrepreneurs and businesses through partnerships with foreign capital and further deepen local linkages. Addressing challenges to do with energy in production and productivity through the promotion of renewable energy technologies, which is one of the key strategies in one of the current development plans, needs further strengthening, as energy is a key enabler of industrialization, beneficiation, and value addition. In terms of employment, what we observe is that there's been a substantial decline in the share of employment in agriculture, declining from 73% in 2005 to 54% in 2015. And this change was largely absorbed by the wholesale and retail sectors, which became the largest employer. And agriculture, as you can see from that figure, is largely characterized by low productivity and labor share. That the smallest portion there shows the share of agriculture and the low gross value added per worker, which is significantly lower than the other sectors. Employment status points to very little improvement in the quality of jobs over time. The majority of the workers, around 77%, are employed in what is categorized as vulnerable employment as of 2015, and these categories are often associated with lower and less secure incomes, as well as limited employment opportunities, including pensions. Also, we observe that there are higher levels of casualization in the labor market across all sectors. There is also income-related underemployment, which continues to remain high. Youth unemployment also is recorded to be very high and largely remains an urban phenomenon, although it declined between 2000 and 2014 from 12.7% to 10.5% in 2014. It's still high, and in the region it exceeds some of the comparator countries such as Malawi. Foundation skills for the youth show a significant improvement when we look at youth literacy, which has improved significantly from 74.5% in 1990 to 88.7% in 2010, and almost converging with the comparators in the region. When it comes to secondary education and technical and vocational education training programs, we notice that this has gradually increased. Secondary enrollment has shown a slow improvement, however, between 1990 and 2014, and remained below comparators in the region. Educational attainment and skills levels have risen to levels that match the upper end of the regional standards. Mean years of schooling have continued to improve over the years, and on the higher side when you compare to comparators in the region. Skills, the bulk of them, about 80%, in the medium skills level, while the high skills level constitutes only 8%. The low labor productivity and high unemployment, especially of the youth, requires an enhancement of productivity and skills upgrade strategies to target higher-end productivity sectors. We observe also that a high-skilled youthful population will provide a platform for accelerating structural transformation, and therefore programs need to be fast-tracked in this area. And currently there are programs which target development and access of technology, research and development promotion, and scientific management of work system adaptation. These should enhance structural transformation. Further, there is a skills development fund that was established, as well as construction of tertiary institutions, universities, and colleges, which will specialize in science, technology, and engineering, as well as maths. Also, the provision of learning infrastructure and a well-equipped technical education and vocational training institutions will further improve the national skills database. Investment in vocational and training skills, targeting the youths, will contribute to reducing unemployment and positively impact structural transformation, and the youth will possess skills that are transformative in the economy. In terms of society, we notice that this continues to be undermined by a slow demographic dividend and high child dependence ratios and high urbanization, which exerts pressure on infrastructure and services, which in turn result in high poverty of income. As we notice from the graph there, poverty has been declining, but it is still high at 54.4% in 2015. And programs to address these need to be scaled up. I will go to the issue of some social issues there. Positive trends have been noticed in fertility, life expectancy, but there are still concerns about stunting levels, communicable diseases, and non-communicable diseases, which continue to hamper people's participation in the economy, and programs to address these need to be expanded if structural transformation was to be realized. In terms of the key messages, first is that diversification from the high dependence on copper is an imperative. Then beneficiation and value addition in copper sectors is necessary to accelerate structural transformation. And transforming the agricultural sector through modernization is potentially going to provide the impetus for structural transformation. And there's also need to harness the strong private sector consumption as an enabler of structural transformation. And then foreign direct investment is something that is critical for the growth of the manufacturing sector. Of the manufacturing sector, and needs to facilitate active participation of local enterprises through various commodity value chains. And lastly, the critical shortage of transformative skills needs to be addressed to realize structural transformation in full. The high youth unemployment is a social time bomb, but if harnessed properly, that is a useful resource. And poverty and inequality also remain high, and policies aimed at these need strengthening. Lastly, the critical shortage of transformative skills need to be addressed if structural transformation is to be realized in Zambia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I would like to ask the audience to applaud all of the presenters for their good work. The DS had already identified, let's say, the major commonalities and differences between the four countries that we discussed today. But let me pick, before I invite the discussants, pick a couple of things that came out from the presentations today. I think there is the contrasting case of Morocco, where the phosphate industry, which for many years used to be the key export-earning commodity, that is declining in favor of the automobile industry. I think that is very important to note. But at the same time, you have Cameroon and Zambia that are still dependent on the export of their mineral resources. And especially Cameroon and many of other countries in Central Africa, they've been exposed to external shocks that triggered macroeconomic instability. I think that is clearly indicates the importance of diversify and structurally transform those economies. I think it was also clear that in certain of the countries that we've reviewed, the informal sector is still a major issue. So how to mainstream them and bring them on board, it becomes important. The skills mismatch, I think, is a concern. And again, the case of Cameroon and more importantly in Zambia, is still, the copper industry is still an enclave industry. What kind of policies, therefore, should be put forward to address all of those issues? How to promote industrial policy? We have amongst us, as I indicated earlier, people that can provide the necessary answers to some of the challenges that have been identified through this country, the STEPS profiles. By the way, I think we should state again that the STEPS profiles, as it used to be the case of the country profiles, those are diagnostic tools that gives us a snapshot, a picture of what our countries are. And we identify the headline issues and messages and findings to engage further into policy reflections and the search for solutions. And I believe the panelists that are here with us, many of them have been on the forefront of developing solutions to some of the problems that they've identified. We have amongst our panelists, His Excellency Mr. Mekonnen Manya Zewal, who doesn't need any introduction if you are an Ethiopian. He has been involved in many of the major policy formulations of this country, from the formulation of master plans to promote industrial developments to anything else related to it. So His Excellency Mr. Mekonnen Manyaka, has the rank of minister. He's the executive director of the Ethiopian Development Research Institute, which is the prime think tank on in this country in things to do with economic and social development. He has led all sorts of government high-level positions, including as Vice Minister for Planning and Economic Development. He was also State Minister for Finance and Economic Development for many years. He also served as Minister of Industry, leading the implementation of industrial policy and plans, and so on and so forth. So I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Mekonnen Manya Zewal to offer his own views and perspectives about this country profile. I have a set of questions that are just indicative of what is expected from you, Your Excellency. First, the Economic Recovery and Development Initiative had the opportunity to the Ethiopian Development Research Institute had the opportunity to review and comment on the STEPS profile, the Ethiopian profile. As my colleague Andy had mentioned earlier, this was a very, very useful conversation. and would like to thank you very much for having been present and led your team in those discussions. There were 7 key messages that emerged out of the STEPS profile and of those discussions. What is, in your opinion, in terms of their criticality, relevance, and depth, what are the most important messages as far as you are concerned? And which ones of those merit a special attention in order to accelerate structural transformation in Ethiopia? Andy has mentioned that there is significant progress already being made, but there is more to be done. So what, in your opinion, should Ethiopia do with a view to attaining a sustainable growth rates? We've learned that we require more than 2 decades of continued and sustained growth at double-digit levels. Is that possible? And what needs Ethiopia to do? Your Excellency.
Thank you. I would like to appreciate ECA for providing me with the opportunity to discuss on the profile and also the moderator for the introduction. Before answering directly to your questions, let me comment also on the conceptual framework. I think having broad definition would help to understand that the issue of structural transformation is not only about moving labor from low productivity to high productivity, but there are complementary processes that one has to be aware and monitor and have programs so that the transformation, the core transformation agenda is not constrained in the middle of the process. So from that perspective, I think having a broader definition is good. It creates common understanding. We know what we speak of. So from that angle, I think it's good. But I'm also felt, okay, these are blocks. You have employment, you have production, you have society, and sub indicators. But there is no organizing framework. Where do all of this take us? What is the end product? I mean, in terms of historical experience, growth has been the key driver of the structural transformation. So I don't see in the conceptual framework that this is articulated well. All of these different parts need to be brought to a close, to closure. So we discuss production, then summarize. Of time. So agricultural development-led industrialization is the core strategy. All others comes to support to realize this. So for me, growth is important, but the conceptual framework doesn't discuss faith, social values, cultural values, and these are key players in terms of historical, economic, and structural transformation. That dimension might help. Okay, having said that, I think the key messages for me, at least in terms of privatization, is clearly articulated in our current review of the growth and transformation plan. It is about agricultural transformation, which we have mentioned here. We have to continuously improve the productivity of agriculture, both to contribute to manufacturing in terms of inputs, circulations. So agriculture needs to continue improvements. We haven't reached the African level or the historical other countries' level of productivity. We haven't improved productivity, but still we work. There is a great opportunity within agriculture. It's not only about crop, it's also about livestock, adding value to our large livestock products. So agriculture will continue to be the centerpiece for industrialization. We need to create, we have a young population, we have expanded education, we have literate, young, easily trainable workforce now because of the expansion of primary, secondary, and workforce institutions. Accompanied by vocational and technical training, which the manufacturing sector requires. So, to create jobs in terms of our strategy, labor-intensive, resource-based, light manufacturing is a way forward for us, and that is articulated also in the growth and transformation plan. Textiles, garments, leather, which have a strong backward linkages and also forward linkages. Agro and processing industries to add value to agricultural products. So, labor intensive, while they help us to change the structure of the economy, diversify, help us to diversify the structure of the economy. At the same time, they help us create jobs. And I should add, in terms of manufacturing, the role of the small and medium enterprises, which we give, I think, a significant focus in our which the report really misses, because they are tools for us for employment generation and also a learning platform in terms of technology absorption, learning by doing, and which will help us create broad base of the private sector. So everybody started small and over time with effective support, institutional support, those will grow into medium and large. That's what the historical experience of rapidly transforming economies have shown.
Yeah. If I may, Your Excellency, you've identified the role of institutions as one particular dimension that perhaps we need to
d'après vous, devrait être mieux étudié et ressortir plus solidement dans notre cadre. En tant que l'un des architectes de cette stratégie de la transformation structurelle, que pensez-vous du rôle de l'État, de nos gouvernements? Un peu plus tôt, a mentionné
performance, or the extraordinary performance of the economy in Ethiopia has been driven by state-led investments and so on. is there any possibility to add more layers to that growth trajectory, and what are those possibilities, and what needs to be done? So, in essence, do you think that the current model has reached its maximum potential, or there are changes that need to be done in it? So a little bit of that about the institution changes that will be required for you to continue your impressive growth.
I think the role of institutions is critical, particularly the state. If you have to accelerate growth transformation, the leadership of the state need to have a vision, not only vision, committed to that vision in terms of policy and programs, translate those into action and implementation. So commitment to defining the vision and the policies, commitment to translate those policies into actions. So for us, we have series of development plans, which actually based on the strategies to transform the agriculture. We have an extensive extension system at farm level in different rural areas, which provide technology services to the farmer, and that is the driving force behind the productivity improvement in agriculture. And we have invested in human development. The private sector cannot do for you in the context of low-income countries like Ethiopia. So the state has to take leadership in investing in primary education, tertiary education, so that you have trained human resources to take up, to manage, to lead, innovate, if you like. And thirdly, you have to have a healthy population, so investment in health system, and we have designed an extensive health extension system where they provide services at the local level. They interact with the population. So this, who else can do except the state? So you need to have a developmental perspective. The nature of the problem in low-income countries like Ethiopia is structural, and markets only cannot solve, address. So if you look at the bulk of our public investment, public resource allocations, these are the priority areas. So we are creating the foundation for long-term growth, investment in infrastructure, road, power. Your manufacturing needs power. Who is going to invest? So I think it plays critical role, and also you have to create supportive institutions to support sectors, private sector. Take, for example, I think our industrial policy have evolved, learning either from our own experience and from a historical experience. Support institutions have been there in the textile, in leather, in agro industries, which closely work with the private sector.
Thank you very much. Indeed, in one of our publications, we talk about dynamic industrial policy, one that evolves. Je voudrais maintenant inviter...
I would now like to ask Professor Lambert Mbenga Mbamba. He's the director at the Tufo University. Students, PhD students. Professor Bamba is very well known in West Africa, and among us here, we are your students. So Professor Bamba has been lecturing lecturing since 1989. He's a lecturer in economics and management in the Center for Economic and Social Research. And he does a lot of academic activities, and regularly he has been a technical advisor of various ministries: tourism, artisanal affairs, national education. He works closely with us as one of advisors. So for you, Professor Bamba, I would like you to share your experience and your wisdom with us, to give us an opinion with us, or your opinion on what is happening in Cameroon, Zambia, what is happening. And the question is the following: the steps analysis in 5 countries, including Benin, shows that the results are mixed regarding development in the manufacturing sector, which is considered by all. Even His Excellency has said that it is a sine qua non for economic transformation and job creation. What is more alarming is that this sector is declining in Cameroon and Zambia, but our colleagues have underscored this. That, for example, in Zambia, due to the collapse in raw material prices, commodity prices, they have a very difficult budget situation, and the same holds good in Cameroon. Can we envisage structural transformation of African countries without going through a development of the manufacturing sector, especially the services and the primary manufacturing sector? This was made clear in the presentation that was made earlier on, demonstrating that in the case of Zambia, we have a situation whereby the services sector is the most dominant. So please, Professor Bamba, what's your opinion on this important question?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Let me congratulate all the presenters for their remarkable job. It is true, if so, I've been involved in this endeavor very early, and I know how the reports have developed, and appreciate the quality of the performance. Now, to return now to the issue you raised, I think my answer unequivocally would be to say that it will be impossible for us to achieve a structural transformation in Africa without us being able to go through the primary manufacturing sector. We have to go through those steps, the manufacturing sector and the primary processing sector, because this is the historical analysis from a 2015 study done by one of my former students, Dr. Gio Felix, PhD student, who has tried to look at this matter, and he shows clearly that England, Japan, France, and so on and so forth, all of them went through the primary sector stage, then up to the secondary industrial sector, before now getting to the services sector. And the rationale, the logic behind it is that when productivity is increasing in the primary sector, it releases some production assets that can now be allocated to the secondary sector. And as soon as this actually begins to be developed, there is a need, a growing need for sophistication in distribution, whereby the services section now takes over in order to be able to support the whole manufacturing or transformation process. The study that I mentioned earlier on, when he compared this with what is happening in the BRICS, India, China, Brazil, and the conclusion he reached was that we can see that India and Brazil are moving from the primary sector straight into the services sector without sufficiently developing the secondary sector. And what he also looked at, a number of other countries, Malaysia, South Korea, there was another country, I've forgotten the name, but it shows that they went through the example of countries like Japan, France, and England. Therefore, apparently, it seems clear that the normal process is, number one, develop the manufacturing sector after developing the primary sector, which will now enable a structural transformation to take place. And the example I gave earlier on in the case of Brazil and India can cause us to interrogate the matter. It is a matter of analyzing further to know whether the development of the transnational corporations, which is the reason why we have this tertiary sector, which is becoming a necessary stage, becoming to go from the necessary stage tertiary sector, from the primary to the tertiary sector. More is that development is from the primary sector developing. We go on to industrial sector development, industrial manufacturing. Thank you very much. Industrial development, industrial manufacturing. The digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution. With the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution, it is really something that we remain the same under whether the process will remain the same of your presence here. And I avail myself of your presence here to interrogate the case of Morocco as is presented. This is presenting to be a unique case because Morocco can be a unique case because the Moroccan manufacturing sector internal dynamic character is going through an internal dynamic decline of traditional industrial decline of traditional industrial styles, industries, metallurgy, electronic and mechanical industries. But this new dynamic has not made up for the decline in the traditional or conventional job creation sector. So what lesson can be drawn from this double dynamic in Morocco, from this dynamicization in Morocco? So what's more, you think the sophisticated industrialization which would lead to structural industrialization which would lead to structural transformation? Yes, I think indeed the case of Morocco indeed seems to show that there's an acceleration in the structural transformation process. In fact, when we look at the historical, most countries that have developed and are currently called the modern economies start currently first level economies. Cottage industries, traditional industries like cottage industry, leather, textiles, then move on to more sophisticated. So this is the combination of classic process. So this is the question that is raised by the study, the case question that is raised by the study. This process, it would appear that the new industrialization is not able to absorb the labor force which is being abandoned by the traditional sector. So this brings up new stakes and serious questions that require that we interrogate them. I think the presentation that was done by the case study here opens up some prospects. The case of Ethiopia as well as Morocco have shown we can have the impression that these two economies, which are good examples of structural transformation among the case studies that we've had, we can look at them and realize that we can do technology transfer, but apart from that, the local private sector is not totally committed in the same process. So here again, this is a source of concern, because if the local private sector is not engaged, committed in terms of redistribution of income from this new growth, there's not a lot that's going to be left behind. And we can see this with the level of employment in this new sector, which is not as high as in the conventional traditional sectors. And there again, we get the impression that the local factors of production are not sufficiently involved in this structural transformation. So I think these are so many aspects that we can look at and make relevant recommendations to see how we can take on board these new aspects. Of course, we can attract foreign direct investments, but apart from that, we can get the local government to develop strategies that will enable local private sector to support or be involved in this process. Why not develop national champions that will be part of this new change, and that will enable us, on the other hand, to absorb local manpower, local labor in this process. So this is what I wanted to say, and this is one of the lessons that I'm drawing. We can interrogate once more the role of local investors and entrepreneurs. Interrogate the role of local labor. Its productivity is not improving. Consequently, the structural adjustment programs continue. All the stages that have been presented, so we need to work on this. Labor productivity is now to the structural transformation successful. Unfortunately, the infrastructure has to go because there is too much in a
Mais avant ça, I would like to invite
the interpreters were to be here till 1 o'clock, so now they have to go. The interpreters were to be here till 1 o'clock.
And Mr. Mane is a very good friend of ECA and my friend too. He is currently the director of the UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa. He has a very long and distinguished career, before, especially with the UNDP, but before joining the UNDP, he used to be also a senior staff member with the ADB and so on and so forth. Let me go through a couple of important milestones in his career. He was the United Nations Resident Coordinator and United Nations Development Program Resident Representative in Rwanda, and before that in Congo, Brazzaville. And since 1996, he was also, as I indicated, a very senior staff member with UNDP in the headquarters in New York, as well as in several country offices, including in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and as I indicated also, he worked with the African Development Bank and with the International Monetary Fund. He originates from Gambia, where, of course, he worked the Ministry of Economic Plan and the Central Bank. He's a graduate from the Harvard University. I would like Mr. Lamine to focus your comments on a very important dimension which came out very quite strongly in the presentation of the country profile of Cameroon, which is to do with rule of law, which is governance, the red tape. In every business enterprise surveys that have been conducted in that region, that aspect has become one of the major issues. So My question, therefore, is how fundamental is good governance to generating and sustaining social and economic transformation? And what should countries do with a view to addressing any shortcoming on those particular domains? In terms of, and earlier, His Excellency Minister Ngone had indicated His Excellency institutions. So what kind of policies and strategy should be and a view to addressing the shortcomings, the view to addressing shortcoming growth, quality growth, and the insertion of our economies in global value chains? So your views would appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I think it is in order for me to start by thanking the CE, particularly my big sister, Giovanni. I know that she had been a great driving force behind my participation. And as you have said, I am a strong fan of the partnership between ECE and at least for UNDP, of which I have been at least for the entire UN system. And I believe my record in this regard is very strong. Now, preceding what is going on in the UN system reforms, this goes back to my days in New York, when I put in place in New York, when I put in place I facilitated putting in place a very strong EU between the EU and many other UN agencies. The reason for it is not to take too much in the ongoing UN reforms. But probably before I answer your concerns directly, let me also say that I believe that we're privileged to be given this topic because let me also say that I believe it is simply to even the state in all those presentations. It is they talk about navigated in all the presentations. When we talk about transformation, I believe that at the heart of the whole notion of transformation is governance, a more proactive governance, a more proactive governance. I would like you will all appreciate governance. I would like to associate the governance to the notion of recently transformation. Just recently, but going back to the earlier issues of transformation. If you look at the definition of transformation, just to remind you, I know you all know it, but one of the concepts, in fact, is a more transformative. It derives from mechanical process. We are transforming. Derives from mechanical process. Transform materials, not just the groundnut, but the material chemical sense. Not just the groundnut, but in the chemical sense. When you transform something, you transform it in the chemical process. So, embedded in that is a deliberative, effort, and that's about governance. So, if we look at now to remind you again about the earlier, those of you who did economics, the earlier developmental economies, like Rodan, means the deliberate, put that emphasis, transformation, forming the deliberate approach, and transforming the economies. And when we define governance, it means managing the affairs of countries and individuals. So, Mr. Moderator, I would like to say that governance, the notion of governance, as you have alluded to, is at the heart of transformation. And when you are revising again the approaches, I think we have to bring up that so evident, as you know, in the earlier efforts of transformation in Africa, which we now forget about. You had the leaders like Nkrumah, who actually had very strong transformation, who actually had very, if you look at the industrialization process in Ghana, if you look at the setting up of industrialization, the universities, in many tertiary educational institutions and so forth, and you see the similar trend in Kaunda, Zambia. The ratio of manufacturing in Zambia, or industrial sector in Zambia, reached 30% in Zambia, which is actually seen as the benchmark for industrialization. If you look at the definition that was used by Bob Sutcliffe, the industrial economist at Oxford, he defined industrialization as a process whereby the broad industrial sector will reach 30% of the economy, out of which 60% should be attributable to manufacturing, and then they distribute it to energy, and construction, and then they distribute it to energy, and construction. So I also want to put that concept on the table so that when you are doing the revisions, you should be a little bit more explicit about those important elements of industrialization. So Zambia reached 30%. We have been told that it has now gone down to 10%. So that is significant deindustrialization. So let me not take too long, but we see that phenomenon even in Nigeria. There was in South Africa belong to a different category. There was a deliberate attempt at industrialization in order for them to shield themselves from the sanctions which were imposed on those. Is still that governance is at the heart of those processes, and we should bear that in mind in the current processes. Of course, when we look at the governance, other dimensions, where you have touched on, the Professor has touched on, and Mr. McDonald, you have touched on the issues of institutional and human capacity, institutional building. Stability is very important. Rule of law, stability is so important. Rule of law, which is also very key to the process of stable and transformational development. So let me probably also dwell on to make a contribution to the definition itself, as you have put it out. ECA is in a very strong position. I believe that ECA is in a very strong position to lead the process within the UN systems. As today, in the context of the UN reforms, ECA has been nominated. ECA's role actually as a lead in normative development. But in doing so, you should also set the definitions against those of ASET, of UNCTAD. It's unfortunate that ASET colleagues are not here. They are doing a lot of work there. For UNDPs, the use of society, I like it, but UNDP had come up with human development, which actually captures all those dimensions that are there. The World Bank also is doing a lot of work in this area. So this is to say that in order for you to strengthen your role as a lead in this area, also look at what is going on in the orders. UNCTAD had done a lot of work also on the definition, had done a lot of work also on the definitional dimensions. And one element that I would like to draw your attention to that should be dealt with, which could have been much more dealt with in the cases of Cameroon, is almost uniquely associated with the shifting of economic processes from the so-called low productive sectors like agriculture to manufacturing, and now, of course, service industries are coming in. I think within the process itself, we should look at agriculture. ASET has put a lot of emphasis on that. Agricultural transformation also could represent a significant degree of transformation in the economies, and then it can help, the attainment of the objectives of rapid economic growth and also industrialization in the other sector. So I really want to draw your attention to that. When I come to the last point that you raised, when I come to the last point today that you raised, I also want to relate the issue of governance to. I also want to relate the issue of governance to developmental states. I think all of you are familiar with the fact that those countries today, it may not be exceptional, those countries, mostly those that have attained a significant degree of transformation, are qualified to be categorized as developmental states. Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, Kenya to some extent, Mauritius, Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco. Morocco is also has been recognized as a developmental state, probably not political dimensions, but the deliberative aspect to development. Finally, for the institutional dimensions of transformation, I just want to supplement what Mr. McKernan has said. It's very clear that we have to it is very clear that we have to review the broad educational system. This has been talked about. Between the skills reflected in the mismatch between the skills which come out of educational system, we want to add the needs of the industries. But what we want to add in today's age of technological changes is STEM. I think you mentioned that, the presenter for Zambia. But it is important that we link and also to both basic education and also higher education. And it can be foundational. You don't expect people like Pedro, who are geniuses, after they finish a degree, to be encouraged right from the basic stages. And then adult literacy should not also be neglected, which we would recommend to be tied to dropouts. How do you handle the dropout from educational systems? And then the issue of TVET, I like TVET, again from Zambia. TVET, as opposed to TVET. TVET, you added entrepreneurial education as well. And we are now advocating that this should be linked to, 21st century skills. So you have the normal TVET graduates, but then we need to be deliberative about what we call the soft skills of leadership. The mindset, can-do transformational leadership on the part of people, can-do attitude, and then that is very important for transformation. And then of course technological education. Pedro made reference to the fourth industrial revolution. We are now actually into the fifth industrial revolution. So we need to pay special attention to that with respect to the transformation that Pedro, I believe that governance is key. Pedro, I believe successful governance is governance in all its dimensions, and particularly its leadership. Particularly important for businesses as well, stability for better human rights as well, stability institutional, like for you development. Thank you very much. Institutional development. Thank you very much.
Development institutes. With whom we have collaboration, we have fellows and so collaboration. It's a great economy side, also it's a trade economist, and he is a teacher from Argentina. He specializes in the analysis of cultural and trade policies for the culture and all the creative work, access to the issues. He has been working in the analysis of trade, regional trade agreements, and references. He paper collaboration with paper as a very, very influential level very people. So I would like to go to the bread and butter. I would like to go through the bread and butter where a couple of things were now getting confused about where the test, but now they're confused. One of the questions that was about, one was about which is at the center of transformation, all of those transitions that from Andy to Mama Keita and all the other colleagues, there was reference to that. Some of the gurus, Modric, especially demonstrate that the movement of labor and resources from lower to higher productivity activities is a driver of economic transformation. However, they also note that structural transformation can be growth enhancing or growth reducing depending on the reallocation of labor. You reviewed the from this perspective, how would you qualify the transformation process in Zambia and for that matter in Ethiopia as well? And could you take us back to those foundational issues about structural transformation, foundational issues about structural transformation?
Which are in French, the steps of Cameroon and Morocco, which are in French. I'm sure you would have found notes similar, let's say, headline notes. Could you therefore offer some views about that? And then in the age of the African continental free trade area, I would also like, and your extensive work on trade issues, I would also like to hear your opinion about the centrality of trade in boosting and sustaining structural transformation in the context of the Zambian economy. So we talked about moving from comparative advantage to competitive advantage. So how can you link that with the African continental free trade area? What are the opportunities and challenges there? So the floor is yours. And challenges there. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's quite a challenge, I think I have to do in this 8 minutes. But in any case, I would like to congratulate the UNECA and all the authors, because this is a very timely and very needed exercise. And it's a very good exercise. Actually, it's remarkably good. I mean, how they actually managed to put in areas. And this is precisely at the end what is at the core of this exercise. Why is that you need to do the diagnostics, and at the end, why is that you need economic transformation? And basically it's because you want good quality economic growth, and more important, and this is the big challenge now, is the creation of jobs for a growing population. I mean, they were talking about the demographic window. You need to create those jobs. And although, I mean, when you start looking, I mean, they might see something that is happening, there is job creation. This, in many countries, is occurring in sectors of low productivity. And this is where it comes, this the relationship of that you could create in these jobs in, let's say, the services sector in cities. And probably you are familiar with many barber shops that are in towns, the Boda Boda in Kampala, etc. Rather than creating these jobs in the sectors where maybe productivity is low, but actually there is a potential for productivity growth. And this is at the end what it will generate the increase in income for population. That is at the end what we want. And to achieve that, to achieve these jobs, to achieve this productivity growth is where economic transformation is. Activity growth is where economic transformation is critical. And we have here in these 4 countries a very diverse stories that are explained of many factors, also explained by a sort of position that they are. So clearly you have in the rate of one stream probably is, so clearly you have in one stream probably is that is already launched in a sort of the process, the economic transformation, where actually there are different challenges for Morocco than probably for Zambia. Clearly for Morocco is an economy that has achieved, based on this, a certain level of diversification of their economy, where actually it's more now try to get that all firms, for example, are in the same level of productivity, trying to reduce the heterogeneity of productivity that exists within sectors. And this is when I would like to introduce this idea of structural transformation of two components. One is the structural change that we have been discussing, and the within sector productivity. And on the other extreme, you have the case of Zambia and Ethiopia, that basically they are in the low income spectrum, and actually they are trying to diversify their economy, where structural change play a key role. And here, for example, you have two stories on how this is happening. Clearly, in the case of Ethiopia, there have been economic growth, clearly has been shown, with a structural transformation explained to a certain extent by within sector productivity. There has been improvement in the agricultural sector, but also by the development of other sectors. And here is where the structural change plays a key role. In the case of Zambia, what you're seeing is that whilst there have been some economic growth, I mean, you can't sort of account for that economic growth, that has been mainly explained by changes in commodity prices that have affected, in some sense, the growth rate. But you are not seeing that sort of structural transformation that is needed for that process to be sustainable into the future. If you think, for example, Ethiopia maybe is in a sort of path of structural transformation, Zambia is not there yet. And there is when you need to think, okay, what is the difference between the two countries, etc. And here's probably where it is very important also to look into what type of policies and how is the success of implementation of those policies in these two countries. And this is something that it would be very good that in the diagnostic is another element that is quite present there. I mean, there have been some analysis on the policies, but I think it should be like another component. So as you are analyzing the data, etc., it's also important to analyze what are the governments doing at that precise moment to change this picture in 5-10 years, if that will be the case. So I think we have these two stories. Something I would like to highlight that it wasn't mentioned, that applies probably to the cases of Morocco and particularly Cameroon, is the sort of middle-income trap story. Because, I mean, it's very easy to go from low income into middle income countries, but it's very hard to get out from there. And basically the country, that managed to do that transition from low income into high income, that is at the end, you can count it with your fingers of your hand. And there is where you start seeing, for example, in the case between Morocco and Cameroon, you see two different stories. Clearly, Cameroon, you may anticipate that is sort of trap in that story. Morocco seems to be in a path to leave that sort of trap. And I am not too worried about that sort of trap. And I am not too worried about the fact that Morocco, that the show manufacturing is producing, is falling, because you are seeing transformation within the manufacturing sector. I mean, and this at the end, these countries are going to abandon activities that are productivity, that other countries may be more productive, to try to tap into new sectors within the manufacturing sector. or another sector. And here's where I want to discuss a bit the debate between manufacturing, agriculture, and services. There is a story. Clearly, there is this story that was referenced of basically going from the low agriculture activity through the manufacturing activity and eventually to the services activity. This is sort of a story that we know. The problem in many countries, not only in Africa, that they are going from agriculture into services, but not necessarily into the high productivity services. They're going into the low productivity services. And basically, it's that transition that is missing through the manufacturing sector. The problem is that there is a huge debate now about the role of manufacturing in the future. I mean, the manufacture is under a profound transformation. We are talking about automation. We're talking about different things that are going to affect the availability of the manufacturing sector as a sort of a transitional sector. I mean, basically, all countries need to go through that, and the scope of generating jobs, good quality jobs, would be substantially reduced. This is something, for example, that Danny Rodrik is quite pessimistic in that sense. He says that basically the manufacturing train has gone. That needs to lead us to think about, is there any role for services in the transformation process? Clearly there is. Clearly we're talking about modern services. We're talking about financial services. We're talking about engineering services, insurance services, because increasingly, if you think not only manufacturing, but every economic activity, including agriculture, is about services. Doing industrial policy today is about doing policy on the services sector in many cases. So I think that this sort of thing needs to be also considered in the discussion, how you can tap into this discussion, how you can tap into different sectorial experiences to try to achieve this transformation process. And now let me enter into the trade sort of discussion about the importance of trade. I mean, one of the things why manufacturing is such a good sector for the transformation process is, first, because it absorbs a lot of low skill employment that come from the countryside, potentially. So that sort of manufacturing development comes with the urbanization story, but also because it's a tradable activity. So clearly, you will be able to achieve higher productivity in the manufacturing sector and to any sector if you if you export, for sure, because if you have to compete into the world market with a product, but also if you are also facing some competition in your market. And at the end, the story is about, particularly talking about value chains, is how you combine inputs, goods, and services from different sources, into the different sources, into the sort of task type of activity. When you're talking about advantage or not, I think that when you mention about the comparative advantage or not, and clearly the availability of resources play a key role, but basically the skills challenge is what is the new thing. And this is how you put these two things together, what play a certain role. So in terms of trade, clearly the continental free trade area is a big thing to try to, in the first, probably at the regional level. Remember that these processes, value chains, tend to be still very regional. So I think there is still a lot of work to do, actually, to facilitate trade, to develop certain value chains, regional value chains, that could eventually integrate regional value chains, that could eventually integrate into global value chains. But frequently, as I said, frequently is when you think about industrial development, etc., the first thing that comes is actually, well, you need to protect your industry, your sector, and many experiences I don't think that in Africa, and there are many experiences then in Africa and in other regions that where actually has sort of led into a government. So what we did to us in America, where I come from, basically this has been an issue, the protection of the sector. You are not being exposed in those sectors to high productivity sectors. And at the end of the day, it's a very costly process, if you will. So clearly, the trade component and the trade policy angle is one that needs to be considered, trying to align that policy to try to facilitate the adoption of technologies, try to facilitate the adoption of technologies, the adoption of high and eventually competitive inputs to global, and eventually trying to integrate into global markets.
Very useful. Thank you very much. Some tensions emerging now. Professor Bamba earlier had mentioned that we have to go through manufacturing necessarily. And Marx is saying that with the fourth or fifth industrial revolution and the technology disruptions that are associated with it, and perhaps manufacturing might not be there at all with all the automation and so on and so forth. So this is of course a conversation that cannot end today, and we cannot end this launch without providing you with an opportunity. I'm talking about now all the distinguished participants here. You share in 1 minute or so your most critical view or contribution to the panelists and to the authors also. 1 minute to address it. So yes, Morocco. Yeah, thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et d'abord, je remercie tous les intervenants pour toutes ces interventions. Économie. Tout ce que j'ai pu en fait avoir comme information sur cette transformation structurelle, de tout le débat qui s'est bien passé en ce moment, ce que j'ai pu retenir, c'est d'abord augmenter l'offre. Augmenter la production, et ce n'est pas n'importe quelle production, mais c'est la production de certains secteurs qui présentent une forte valeur ajoutée, et ces secteurs qui permettent la création de l'emploi et de l'emploi décent. Donc voilà, moi c'est comme ça que je définis la transformation structurelle. Pour le cas du Maroc, comme vous l'avez dit, comme ça a été montré tout à l'heure, c'est que le Maroc connaît une transformation structurelle un peu lente, ça c'est clair. Et ça se voit d'abord dans la structure de son économie. Au Maroc, l'agriculture a encore un poids dans l'économie. Ça représente autour de 13%, le PIB agricole représente autour de 13% des PIB. Et donc, mais quand on regarde un petit peu l'impact de l'agriculture sur la croissance dans les années passées, il avait un impact très fort, c'est-à-dire que toutes les années passées, il a mis un impact. D'abord, c'était dû à l'application de l'aménagement des secteurs agricoles, mais depuis un certain temps, la réforme des secteurs agricoles, ils ont pu certainement ce secteur, la réforme secteur devient maintenant un peu industrialisé, et donc les fluctuations du secteur ont été réalisées, et l'impact du PIB global, ils ont été réduits, et l'impact réduit le PIB global, ce secteur agricole aussi dans le Maroc, le problème c'est que c'est un secteur agricole qui emploie au Maroc, le problème c'est que c'est un secteur, la part qui emploie dans le secteur agricole reste très élevée, ça c'est un peu le secteur agricole reste donc très élevé. Et la transformation de secteur pour la transformation de ce secteur, et la transformation vers le secteur industriel comme vers le secteur industriel comme beaucoup plus il y a une transformation du secteur agricole vers le secteur de transformation dans certaines mesures vers le secteur service, dans certaines mesures vers le secteur il y a une transformation structurelle à l'intérieur des secteurs du manufacturier. Structurelle, ça transformation des secteurs du manufacturier. C'est que ça vient de faire, il y a des secteurs qui sont peu connaît certains, il y a notamment le secteur textile, connaît certains secteurs, le secteur très important, un grand secteur, très important d'emploi en termes de grand morpheur d'emploi, mais en termes de valeur d'emploi, donc là il passe vraiment en négatif, mais en termes d'emploi, donc il a des effets négatifs, et en fait, ce secteur qui a connu ce secteur, ça a été parce que peut-être que c'était pas un secteur assez, parce que c'est productif, parce que le Maroc, il est ouvert sur une grande partie des pays du monde, avec des accords d'échange avec les pays, donc on n'avait pas le choix, donc il n'y avait pas de barrière, et puis le secteur, surtout le barrière, et puis le secteur, surtout le secteur textile a connu ses effets négatifs, mais il n'y a pas que le secteur textile, en fait, parmi les secteurs industriels qui a connu cette baisse ou qui a stagné, il y a aussi qu'a connu le Maroc depuis plus d'une dizaine d'années et qui concerne surtout le secteur industriel. Il y a, en fait, on visait à travers ces stratégies, on visait une augmentation de la part de l'industrie dans le PIB. Et donc, si on prend rien que l'industrie de transformation, on voulait passer à 23% du PIB. C'est vrai, il y a des efforts qui ont été faits, mais cette part-là, on ne l'a pas encore atteint. Mais moi, je pense que les perspectives, c'est-à-dire pour atteindre cette part de l'industrie dans le PIB et aussi pour le développement de ces secteurs, je pense qu'on a de bonnes perspectives, du fait que, d'abord, il y a un point qui n'a pas été... présenté dans la présentation, c'est qu'au Maroc, on a développé tellement l'infrastructure. Le secteur de l'infrastructure est tellement développé. Et ça, je pense que c'est un point très important. D'abord, ensuite, ça permet d'améliorer le climat des affaires, d'attirer des investissements qui ne cessent d'augmenter. Et c'est grâce à ces investissements que ce secteur de l'industrie a connu des transformations. Maintenant, on a ce qu'on appelle les métiers mondiaux du Maroc qui commencent à prendre de l'ampleur, qui commencent à connaître, comme ça a été dit tout à l'heure, on a le plus grand secteur d'exportation, c'est le secteur automobile. Et puis, donc, ça montre bien que peut-être qu'au niveau de l'intégration, donc, peut-être qu'au niveau de l'intégration, on n'est pas encore, mais l'intégration, ça s'améliore. Et donc, je peux vous dire qu'on a de bonnes perspectives pour l'avenir, pour le développement du secteur industriel. Le collègue a bien montré a bien dit que la balance commerciale au Maroc, il est structurellement déficitaire. Maintenant, il est déficitaire par des biens d'équipement. Et je pense que ça, c'est un bon point, et je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would invite you, but there's one point which Max had mentioned earlier, which is this issue of the middle income trap. I think moving forward and internally for ECA, one of the things that we need to facilitate internally for ECA, one of the things that we need to facilitate is the study to learn the peer learning from other countries, so that they can learn the peer issue. In our presentation, it's very important. We should, in our presentation, in Cameroon, we clearly indicated that has been for decades in the middle income, but the lower end of the middle income are there in new age. It's a important market, and they are there for ages. So it's important really to find policies to go out of that thing. So this.
Thank you very much. I would like to also thank you very much. I would like to thank. I have two interesting discussions as well. I have two brief comments. First one is on the course presentation. The first one is on the conceptual framework indicated by His Excellency Atumakuna Manaziwal. When we talk about, I think, when we talk about structure transportation, we are referring to three things. The first one is ecological transformation. Third and second one is social transformation. Third element is environmental transformation. There are three pillars of structural transformation. Then I think what you call sustainability. When you talk about this one, then we are addressing what you call sustainability from the structural transformation. Now, I was expecting from the paper presentation to develop a kind of composite index of structural transformation for this country profile. Second remark part is related to the first. Now, on the quality about the transformation is moving. Now, I heard about labor is moving from one sector to another. And for example, if labor is moving from a low productivity sector, then we have low productivity sector. Then we have growth retarding structural transformation. That's the case in Ethiopia, for example. The case in other countries. For example, labor is moving from a low productive agriculture to another low productive service sector, like wholesale and retail trade. And wholesale and retail trade, this is an activity which has very low backward and forward linkages. This is not useful in terms of inducing structural transformation. Now, my question is that this is boundary in the policy targeting of this strategy.
J'ai compris que nous avons parmi nous honorable représentant du Bénin, Monsieur Akouré. Oui, est-ce que vous m'intégrez nous avons un petit commentaire, même que nous n'avons pas fait la présentation du profil de la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Président.
Vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Président. C'est un réel plaisir pour le Bénin, pour l'ambassade de prendre part à cet événement pour lequel il a eu à confirmer son intérêt, pour lequel il a eu à la transformation structurelle de l'économie à travers la culture et avec ses incidences positives sur la production, l'emploi et au niveau de la société, au cœur du programme d'action du gouvernement. Et le Bénin, les décideurs, le gouvernement culturel considère l'agriculture comme une priorité. D'ailleurs, lorsque vous prenez la structure de l'économie béninoise, l'agriculture est dominante. Mais il y a des défis évidents. Que vous prenez le plan stratégique du développement du secteur de l'agriculture, il y a des projections audacieuses, mais les résultats ne sont pas souvent ceux attendus, parce que lorsque on considère le domaine des produits, l'exploitation qu'on prend le coton, produits presque chaque année, lors des campagnes, on observe les risques liés à l'évasion des récoltes par les épidémies qui déciment le potentiel attendu. Donc ça fait une sorte de perte de ressources pour la population qui s'y consacre, et c'est devenu comme une sorte de fatalité, parce que beaucoup de ressources sont consenties dans ce secteur, mais la diminuée par les risques naturels. Donc il y a là la nécessité d'envisager une maîtrise de l'agriculture du secteur par la mise en place des technologies innovantes, et donc ça exige par conséquent des investissements d'une grande échelle, ce qui n'est pas souvent à la portée de nos États qui subissent ou bien qui prennent un déficit qui restreint leur marge de manœuvre. Donc nous avons rejoint cette réflexion un peu tard, parce que les travaux étaient orientés par les travaux. Donc on se demandait si l'événement allait se tenir. Donc on se demandait si l'événement allait se tenir. Donc l'assurance, il y avait eu du mal. Nous avons entendu beaucoup de choses. C'est une opportunité pour nous. Nous avons que du mal de choses. Et c'est la question que je m'avais posée, c'est de savoir si actuel de contraintes au niveau des opportunités ou bien est-ce que les contraintes d'investissement financé. Est-ce que la réflexion aboutit à la mise en place des banques agricoles, ou bien des banques qui accordent à des conditions plus concessionnelles de financement dans le secteur de l'agriculture pour permettre en réalité de mettre la technologie au service du développement agricole. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Because of time constraints, we are unfortunately not going to proceed as I earlier had indicated in terms of providing the opportunity to the panelists and the speakers to say one word or so. There is an ADDJ lecture out there which we are invited to go. There are also other things that we have to take care of. But I would like just to, before I give the floor to Madam Lia, to say discussions during the technical committee meeting. There was one recommendation that asked ECA to track the progress on economic diversification and structural transformational diversification and structural transformational continuous base. I think the steps profile that will be launching soon could be a contribution to that. All of those issues. We have internally to look at all of those issues and see exactly what is the place of this. The other within the context of our business model. The other aspect is to do with what are we going to do next with the current sets of files. Again, each and every one of the question files have lots of unanswered questions which require much more in-depth discussions with our stakeholders at the country level. As usual for all of the country files, we engage in further policy dialogues. And then for areas that require further research, then there will be, of course, in-depth analysis, in-depth studies to clarify some of those issues. But one other thing which I want to say from the discussions today is that there is no one size that fits all, in the sense that there are a couple of fundamental which are key. One country will be in each and every one of our countries will differ depending on our initial endowments, our own political economy, and all of those factors. All of that justifies the need for further discussions and country level interrogating some of those issues so that then we have solutions which are specific to the needs of our countries. So I would like, on behalf of my colleagues in the SROs, to thank you very much for your patience. We've eaten quite a lot on your lunch time, and I know that you have stayed here for hours because the subject is very exciting. And we stay in Mozambique, we will have more time to engage this issue. Thank you very much.
I think you said the final word. I think you said the final word. We have colleagues, if I may, outside. We have colleagues that are waiting outside. I just want to highlight a few things. One thing, actually, in terms of the feedback that we have received on the conceptual and analytical framework. It was clear from some of the discussants here who actually commented on the analytical framework. Younger brother and also my younger brother Lami, two issues came up in terms of improving the analytical framework. One is the issue of institutions and governance, and also as governance, and also the issue of transformation, and also the issue of growth mechanism, which was not adequately felt and was not adequately growth rates, and especially of growth, the high that fundamentals of growth is that fundamental. The second issue that we are living here, the second issue that we are hanging there is this non-linear approach of structural transformation. I think that's the conclusion that we can take, whether it's going to be agriculture, manufacturing, manufacturing, and then modern services, or whether it's possible to go from agriculture to high productivity modern services is an issue that is still out there. Thank you very much. I know that it's a lunch time. We started late due to the fact that plenary sessions were not, and unfortunately some member states could not attend, as the delegate of Benin said. So thank you for being here, and I hope that the discussions were quite enriching.
Just one photo occasion, we are launching the country profiles. If you can hold them, all of you, the steps profiling. You have one? You have
for you to hold and
thank you.
Thank you very much for the panel. Thank you for the Thank you very much. I hope we will have the opportunity to continue.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. The refreshments will be downstairs. You are all invited for the refreshments downstairs. Thank you very much.
The schedule, we're so sorry, we're not able to manage the schedule, we're so sorry, we're not able to manage the schedule.
Thank you very much. Look forward to more occasions.
Thank you. Let's have some time. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Malheureusement, on a eu ce contre-temps. Non, il n'est pas, malheureusement. Oui.